My position at Pear is the director of Accelerator. When I first made the move, it was rather challenging to tell the story that a mathematician or an AI researcher wants to be an investor, wants to be, on the startup side.
Can you tell me a little bit about what are the main traps or mistakes that early founders go into?
Yes, and I think largely speaking, there are two sets of mistakes, three sets of mistakes, but two of them are very much related. The first is internal conflict between founders. The second is not validating your hypotheses. And the third is not being able to find product market fit. So, and let me get into more details on each and every single one of them. The first one, I don't think anything can dissolve a startup more so than founder disagreement. Being co-founders within a startup is a lot like being married. And as we know, every married couple argues, and it's fine. And the question is whether you can survive that argument. And nothing kills a startup more than when founders cannot survive that argument and they have to go through a divorce, right? So I think that's number one. Number two is not validating your hypotheses. A lot of time founders come in with significant industry experience. They've worked in a particular industry for a very long time and they know the trend most of the time better than us. And they have a product or they have a company that they have in mind to build. What they oftentimes ignore is the need to challenge and really validate your hypothesis. You think that you've been in this industry for a while, but you don't really know whether the hypothesis is true or not until you've talked to enough customers. And this is what we really encourage them to do within our startup, which is really to talk to your customers, to have hypotheses that you can validate. So I'll give you one example. DoorDash. The other day I invited Stan Tang, who is the chief product officer at DoorDash. He said that when they first built DoorDash, there was no website. There was no app. It was back in 2013. They put up a website. It was called paloautodelivery.com or something like that, where people can call a number and they basically reach the founders of DoorDash, that's Stang and Tony and a few others. And they will tell them what they want to order. And the founders will take the orders and will call the restaurants, will pick it up themselves and will deliver it to the door. And that's their product. That's their MVP, their minimum viable product. And what they are trying to validate there is there even an interest for people to order food through a third-party central website? That was their hypothesis, right? And over the time, they kept on iterating a series of hypotheses, right? And just because, the founders and their parents have worked in the restaurant industry for a while, it doesn't mean that they know their customers really well. And they know for sure that, yeah, there needs to be a platform for people to order food. It's something that they had to validate. And that actually brings me to my third point, and that is not finding product market fit. Oftentimes you go through these series of hypotheses and, drunk walk, and sometimes it gets hard because you don't really narrow and tighten where the product is going to be. And until you have product market fit, your startup is just going through this random walk process. So not finding product market fit is also a big killer of startups. And associated with that, by the way, is sometimes founders, before they were able to find product market fit, they're too eager to build, right? Let me just build this app. Let me just, build this product. You don't want to build anything. You want to focus on you want to make things as minimum as possible before you build. Otherwise, you're just wasting time and resources and end up building something that nobody cares about. And that also oftentimes kill your startup. So I realize I've spoken a lot, so I'll just stop there.
You've experienced collaboration with many interesting startups, including the ones that are using AI technology somehow, or maybe even using it as their core tech. What would you say are the key differences here when it comes to the product development, also building MVP, maybe the types of challenges that kind of AI founders, I know it's like debatable term, but let's use those as a shortcut or as a hypothesis, have to go through?
Yeah, so I think part of what they have to go through is, so there are roughly speaking three sets of challenges. The first is with the algorithmic development itself. The second is with external validations, and the third is productization. So I think within, when you first have algorithm and you write a mathematical algorithm, you implement it, it works to a certain extent, right? And there's still further R&D happening as they push for the startup. So oftentimes what we see is, on the one hand, they develop their go-to-market strategies and all that, and in parallel with research and development and further polishing of the algorithmic development and how to make it most efficient, they get really, really busy because they have to take care of the two fronts. So that's number one. Number two is really, once the algorithm is finished, by finish I mean it gets you get a couple of nice academic publications and it's shown to work. All the data sets that you have access to, the next step is to really put it in a real life scenario and see if it works. Oftentimes, a lot of AI healthcare algorithms fail at the real settings, right? And you might have come across to this open source data set called a Mimic. That's the emergency ED department data from Beth Israel Hospital. It's open source. It's one of the largest and probably one of the only open source medical data out there. And a lot of algorithms have been developed based on the Mimic data sets. And they're shown to be very much effective. But once they're deployed in real hospital settings, they fail miserably, right? So there's a gap between academic and clinical development. So that's another challenge that they have to go through. And the third is really productization. Once you have an algorithm, it's not yet a product, and you often have to go through full stack development to make the software into a product that you can sell to vendors and to customers. So I would say those are the top three.
When it comes to investability, making yourself attractive to an investor, what's important, especially at the early stage when you're working on your project?
There are two things that are most important, and they may surprise people when they hear it. One is the founders, the other is the market. We, the early stage investors, focus heavily on founder potentials, and whether we see the people that are pitching to be great founders, to be someone who's able to execute the projects that they propose. And this is because the projects are so early and that there will be so many changes that it's impossible to predict what the eventual product will be. It's impossible to predict what the actual go-to-market strategy or profit will be. Their business model will change 5 times. The product will probably change 6 times before they hit the market. So people is really the only thing that we have. And it's the thing that we focus heavily on. So that's number one. Number two is the market. In order for a business to be so-called venture backable, for us to put money in, we have to make sure that there is enough of a market. Typically speaking, $1 billion US market opportunity is what we're looking for. Yeah, so those are the two.
AI is very, very trendy for many years now, and it created this hype where many startups like to position themselves as AI companies or companies that somehow use AI, and that not necessarily turns out to be true later on. You having background as an AI researcher, you can really kind of look through the type of technology that is being used. How do you differentiate a good AI project from poor AI one?
Yeah, I think the word AI, I don't exactly know what that means. And I think sometimes, if it's a simple linear regression, that has existed for many years before even AI and machine learning become popular. For me, you can call it whatever you want, but I feel like the word AI, has such a, hype-driven connotation, right? That sometimes I shy away from using that word, but it is what it is. I think what differentiates a good use of AI ML from a bad use case is, I think, is really in the scope of the usage. I would say machine learning is pretty limiting in a way that you can't expect machine learning to solve your problem from 0 to 1. It can probably solve your problem from 0 to 90%. And oftentimes what happens is You go from 0 to 90%. And then once you hit that, it's that remaining 10% or even less is a little too complicated to figure out. Now that's where you use machine learning to do it, right? And let me give you an example. I was talking to someone who was working on a robotics project, and he's trying to figure out the trajectory of robot jumping. So just figuring out that trajectory, initially how much force in the velocity that the robot needs to exert, right? And they have an algorithm for that. So you can propose an initial guess, and if the guess is not too far off, the algorithm will say, okay, overshoots a little, let's bring it back. Okay, undershoots a little, and then eventually it figures its way out, right? But it starts with an initial guess, and then to say, okay, this is what the velocity should be, and then slowly it converges to a certain value. That algorithm, by the way, is not AI. Is a pretty standard computer algorithm. But where AI can help is that initial guess, right? If you're too far off, from the guess, your algorithm will not converge. So you can use machine learning to actually narrow down the gap of the guess and make the algorithm converge better. But machine learning in that case is not going to help you figure out how fast the robot or the velocity of the robot at the beginning. That requires what we oftentimes call domain knowledge. There's a priori knowledge that we already know. And I feel like that's very much underestimated in many parts of today's world, in the era of the hype of AIs, that we actually know a lot. Humans actually know a lot already about the existing universe, existing systems, that AI only plays a small part of it. And we shouldn't just discard all the domain knowledge that we have in exchange for a black box whose ability to explain and predict is fairly limiting, to be honest. To make it short, what differentiates a good AI use case versus a bad one is knowing the exact scope in which your machine learning algorithm is applicable. To have a model that can simulate human language to such a great extent. We back the Guardant Health, which is AI liquid biopsy company. It analyzes blood samples for cancer diagnosis. Don't ever become a founder just because it's a cool thing to do. It won't get you far.